might be a lot of carbon there. It can be buried. If you're standing dead trees and you're inventorying a plot, it's very easy to just measure that dead tree as part of that above ground inventory. So if that inventory is done, you might have that. Down dead wood, sometimes if there's a wildlife habitat assessment, they will often measure down dead wood, but you shouldn't really expect to find a lot of those data. And when it comes to forest floor samples and litter, that's not routinely collected as well. So depending on what measured material you may need to collect that. So in terms of my favorite thing, soil carbon, usually this is a tough one. Some countries do have national soil surveys. In the US, one of our problems is that our soil survey is focused on agricultural lands, and the carbon is quite different from what you have in a forest. So we have some numbers, but they're not necessarily the most appropriate. Forest Inventory and Analysis Program is now adding in some soil, but we don't have all those numbers yet, and they're pretty sparse. Soils are a challenge. Usually you're going to have to sample them. Not technically difficult. However, this is another one of those scale issues on our project level. There's so much local variability that detecting change can be nearly impossible. You have to take so many samples, and it gets quite expensive to analyze them, and just prepare them for analysis is quite time consuming. If you're up more at a regional or country level, you could go with a coarser grid, and so that's something that may be feasible. But for project level, it's really tough in most cases to really be able to detect change with confidence. And this is just due to the normal spatial variability that are in forest soils. The default depth is specified by the country. A lot of people use a meter. The book currently says 30 centimeters is the default, but it varies. Understory, this is something I normally ignore. It's usually in most systems 1 to 2% of all of your above ground carbon, but the stems are multi-stemmed and they branch down low, and so there aren't a lot of equations. You might have to chop the whole thing down and dry it, or you might have to measure every stem, and so it can be an awful lot of work for a very small amount of carbon. So you can see that IPCC says there are tiers, so there's tier 1, 2, and 3, from the basic to the most detailed. So in the United States, since we have the resources, most of we're in tier 3 most of the time, and you can mix tiers for pools. So depending on the tier, you may be able to omit that understory. And again, that's for country level. If you're at a specific project that you're working on for REDD+, that would be stipulated as part of that project development. So you just need to check the program guidance for whatever your particular purpose is to see what rules need to be included. But this one is often a lot of work for a very small amount of carbon. So this is all I'm going to say about wood products. You can see I have a lovely selection of wood products there that all have different lifetimes. And it goes to a lot of different places, and those places, I mean, carbon in landfills actually remains in the landfill for quite some time if it's a sealed landfill. So we tend to forget that. Products do play a role in sequestering carbon. And in the past guidance, it was not usually considered. That has been changed in the 2006 guidelines. So although it can be challenging to account for wood products, it's not required under the 2006 guidance, but it does. There's extensive documentation that is on your flash drive. There is a section in Volume 4 on how to account. They provide, I believe, 3 different approaches, and they don't recommend one. The choice is left to you. And so you decide whether or not you're going to report on wood products, and then you're given several options for that accounting. So we're not going to talk any more about that today, but the material is there if it's of interest to you. Okay, uses for forest carbon data. So I sort of talked about this a little bit. Monitoring, reporting, and verification, you've probably heard about that at least once or more times at this meeting. It's called MRV a lot of times. And you can do MRV for a lot of reasons, actually. And one of the things on your flash drive is Guyana's MRV, most recent MRV report. So you can see an example of what that looks like. So you might do this at a country level. You do it for project, a lot of different reasons. RED Plus, there's a clean development mechanism. There's a lot of just private projects too, where a business might want to invest in a community project to offset its emissions. And so there's just a lot of different reasons, but what they have in common is that they will ask for monitoring, reporting, and verification. If I'm paying you for X tons of carbon per hectare, show me the carbon. And so MRV is important at many different levels, and that's one of the big uses now of forest carbon data, and that's been a big change since I started doing this. Payments from ecosystem services, you'll hear about ecosystem services later today from Emily. Carbon sequestration is an ecosystem service that stacks up really well with other services, and so now you're seeing that as part of ecosystem services portfolios. It's a service that people are being paid for. And again, the person purchasing the credits would want documentation. Oh, we're ahead of schedule. I have a copy. So do people have questions? This is a good time. They're not going, the important thing are the cookies, and they're not going to cut out my cookies yet until 10:30. So if anybody has any specific questions. Yes?
How diverse is the spatial variation in the soil? Really 10% per hectare basis?
It's really, forest soils are really, really challenging. And so they don't just vary from top to bottom. So your highest percentages are, of course, at the top, and then as you go down, but you might have soils that are over a meter deep. So they might only be 0.5% carbon, but it's 3/4 of a meter. So there's a lot of carbon there. But I have literally, I lost count. I've personally made over 2,000 holes. I use a soil core, so I can make a lot of holes really fast. And I've literally made a hole here, and made a hole here. And I have, we always talk plus or minus 10%. They can be 20% different, those two holes. So usually what you're doing if you're doing a project is you might make a lot of little holes and then mix all the soil together and say, okay, that's my number. If you're looking at a state or province, then you can be more dispersed because you're going for a higher level average and you'll probably be outside that tiny variation. But it's really challenging. So if our criteria for detecting change is normally, what is significant change in the soil if moving 2 feet can get you a 20% difference? So I do soils, but I spend a lot of time telling people not to measure them because at a project level it's tough. I would say if you were doing an afforestation project, the results on that are somewhat mixed. If you're changing from a pasture or a grassland, often we see a decline in soil carbon, and then over time it will come back up again. If it was an agricultural land use, probably you're going to see an increase. So in an afforestation situation, I would definitely say make a lot of holes and deposit them and sort of hope that you'll be able to detect change. In forest remaining forest, you've got a large amount of carbon in the soil. It changes very slowly. So there's signal to noise ratio not in your favor. So it's just tough. I don't want to say that it's not worth doing, but soils in terms of change detection really present a pretty substantial challenge. I never tell people what they want to hear on that. I'm sorry, but it's true.
Thank you.
Are there general rules of thumb based on some level of soil classification that there is, on average, a certain amount of carbon associated with, model soils as compared to another kind of soil order or a different level of soil classification?
We do have some rules of thumb. Model soils, obviously, we expect those to be higher. The problem is I've seen examples where people have made a really nice model that might involve soil texture, so percent clay is important. Usually the more clay you have, you expect to have higher soil carbon because it's a fine. And it might have topography and soil texture and soil order, and it predicts really well on this watershed. And then somebody took that model and they exported it 3 states over to a different forest, and none of those variables mattered at all. So It's really a challenging question. We're working on it. There's soils data now as part of forest inventory analysis, and so maybe we can link to an above ground variable like basal area and come up. It's just one of those things, people keep working on it, but we don't even understand what all the drivers are in every system, because it's just standard received wisdom that soil texture is really critical, and yet there have been studies where they found out it wasn't an important variable at all. So I wish I had a better answer, but right now it's sort of a case-by-case basis, but people are working on it. Century is on a lot of models, people use process models to try to get at it, but I just think, the microbial communities that work there, and we don't understand what goes on beneath our feet very well at all. And that's sort of what's driving all of that. I always, someday I'll have maybe a better answer. Not today, sorry. Yes?
You mentioned the question of measuring the ease with which local community people can it also helps to contain costs if you use local people. But is the challenge not trust? If it is in their interest to declare the amount of carbon, will local people be trusted to measure fairly or to tend to overestimate for their own benefits? But I find a very heavy use of external consultants in Africa, and I think it's got to do with lack of trust for local people to say the truth about their estimates of carbon.
I think that's a really excellent question. So I also think it's probably time for another door prize. Who can tell me, in terms of the number, and there are two possible answers here, what is diameter at breast height? Who knows it?
What is the technical definition of that?
Well, we're going to use meters today. So at what height is breast height?
1.3.
1.3? Or 1.4, depending on where in the world you are. So we measure trees at 1.3 or 1.4 meters above the ground. And there are rules, because sometimes a stem will split in two, and you have other situations. So I think what's the uphill side of the tree? Uphill side of the tree? So you stand, if it's on a slope, on the uphill side of the tree, and if the stem is split in two above 1.3 meters, you measure it as two stems. There's a set of rules. And what we do with our forest survey program, they actually have a rigorous, so these are paid crews. This is their job. They're out there in the woods all the time measuring trees. We have a rigorous quality assurance program. And so what they do is they have all their records, so they'll tally and they'll say the species, and they'll do the heights and the diameters. And then another crew, they pick random samples of plots, and another crew will come out and measure that same plot. I believe they call that a hot audit. And so they will see how good a job that crew is doing and what that error level is. And so if you're talking about trust, it's the same rules that everyone uses, because people were saying, yes, it's the uphill slide, that there's an accepted way to do this. And if there is concern on the part of the purchaser of the project, as long as you can spatially relocate that plot and measure those same trees, they could send a check crew out to see how well they're doing. And then I think as long as those reports come back favorably, you can build that trust. But I found generally the crews take pride in their work. And so I think if you have local community members measuring those trees, they're going to do the best job possible. But if you need to reassure the project buyer, you could have an expert team come out. Just make sure they can locate those same plots again. Pull a random sample and send them out to measure. And see, you'll have some error, but they should be fairly close. And that will build, I think that's a way to address that. That's a very good point.
I have a second question, if you don't mind. And that is, how do you take care of seasonal carbon in, say, fruit trees? Is there a rule about when you do that in better? With the mango tree, I suspect you get a whole 20% more carbon at one season as opposed to another.
I would personally solve that situation by eating the mangoes, but we usually don't. You would measure usually every 5 to 10 years, so the time of year doesn't matter, but it's a good point about the fruit, and it's one I haven't encountered. So I think, I mean, if you're doing a complete carbon budget, they would measure everything, but we're usually talking about stem wood, because that's more permanent. So I would probably not worry about the fruit, especially there's so much water. So by the time you got to the dry weight component of that, I would think we would say the highest value of a mango is it being delicious and not the carbon.
I have 2 points. The first one just want you made whether my understanding is right or not. That is the carbon sequestration of forest absorb carbon. It could be say as the carbon thing, and but forest release carbon can be say as a carbon source. This is what is understanding correctly or not. And this is the first point. The second point is any calculation to make the number of the carbon thing and carbon sources, which one is higher, mean that the forest release carbon and the forest absorb carbon, how much is different in terms of the calculation?
We're actually going to get to calculations after the break. So when you're measuring, and I'll talk about the 2 different ways. So you can measure fluxes, in which case your question has a lot more importance. What we usually do, and for country level accounting projects, is measure stocks, so what's on the ground at a point in time. And the stock is sort of a net. So over that 5-year measurement interval, this forest may have been a source at times, it may have been a sink, but that wood represents the net storage. But that will be, we'll get to that in a lot more detail afterward. But the nice advantage of the stock approach, when you measure these stocks, is you don't have to worry about that because you are seeing the net. Did that answer your question?
Just the second one.
Yes.
Oh, I guess the first one is because I understand from here say that the forest can be carbon source or carbon thing. So the carbon thing, that means that the absorb carbon or carbon sequestration is a carbon sink, right? And the carbon source would mean the release of carbon, forest release of carbon. Is it correct?
Right, so your measurements over time, if your amount of forest decreased or a lot of your live trees moved into the dead tree pool, then when you looked at your stocks, you would see your net stock decreasing and know that you had moved into the source. Did I answer your question? Okay. Yes?
Just wondering, this 5-year temporal measurement or ground measurement, why 5 years?
That's common. It could be 10.
It's not dependent on the forest type. Like the trees in Australia, they have a different growth rate for the tropical.
Right, and that's a good question. There is some measurement error. So trees, you know, if they have a really good year and there's a lot of moisture, they may add a lot of diameter. But often in a short period, that added diameter might just sort of be within the error. Because if I measure a tree and you measure a tree and you measure a tree, we're not going to get exactly the same number. So 5 years, you're generally outside sort of that error margin. But you're right, if you have a radiotic pine in New Zealand, it grows really, really fast. And so perhaps it's worth it to them to measure every 3 years. But because of the associated cost, that's the trade-off. So we're usually looking at 5 to 10, and it might be longer depending on the situation.
The standard IPCC deadline.
I don't know that they actually specify it. It may be different in the tiers. I don't know that they get that specific. I just use 5 as an example, but certainly 10 is perfectly acceptable. I've not seen less than 5 actually implemented outside of a research study.
But once you use remote sensing as a tool, then you do it in a more shorter period, right?
I'd like to just thank you. I'm very happy to be here. I think I do remote sensing too, and I think that's kind of makes the question because right now we're talking about measuring carbon stock at the field level, and using remote sensing is basically extrapolating that information to a larger landscape. So we're talking about landscape level, and remote sensing itself has some measurements errors and other processing errors. So I think they're just kind of independent. But in terms of calculating or estimating the carbon stocks at the landscape level, we have to consider those two major errors. That's 100%.
Thank you. And that is, I mean, remote sensing is tremendously useful, especially for change detection, but it doesn't get you out of doing the work on the ground. And that's a trap. A lot of people, when they have a big area, they're like, oh, we use satellites. I'm like, yes, but, you know, until you've done a lot of work on the ground, the eyes in the sky only get you so far. So they complement each other is usually the term I use. You're not off the hook. And especially soil